The morning sun was bright and warm as Sarah Mitchell checked her reflection one last time in her bedroom mirror. Her dark curls fell perfectly around her shoulders, and her navy blue business suit looked sharp and professional. At 42 years old, she had worked incredibly hard to become one of the music industry's most respected producers, with 5 Grammy Awards sitting proudly on her shelf at home. Sarah grabbed her designer handbag and wheeled her small suitcase to the front door of her beautiful Beverly Hills home. Today was important. She needed to fly to New York for a major record label meeting that could change the careers of several young artists she had been mentoring. Her personal assistant, Emma, had arranged everything as usual: the private jet, the car service, and all the necessary paperwork. The black SUV was already waiting in her circular driveway when she stepped outside. Thomas, her regular driver for the past 3 years, greeted her with a warm smile as he opened the car door. "Good morning, Ms. Mitchell. Beautiful day for flying, isn't it?" Sarah smiled back and nodded. She had always appreciated Thomas's quiet professionalism and friendly demeanor. During their drive to the private aviation terminal, Sarah reviewed her schedule on her iPad. The meeting in New York was at 4 p.m., and she had planned everything perfectly to arrive with plenty of time to spare. The drive was smooth and peaceful. Sarah watched the Los Angeles scenery pass by her window while responding to a few urgent emails. One was from a young rapper she had recently signed. His latest track was climbing the charts faster than anyone had expected. Another was from her sister, reminding her about their mother's surprise birthday party next weekend. Sarah smiled, feeling grateful for both her professional success and her strong family ties. As they approached the private aviation terminal, Sarah noticed how quiet it was compared to the main airport. That's why she loved flying private. No crowds, no chaos, just simple efficiency. She could see a few other expensive cars parked nearby and some well-dressed people walking into the terminal. Everything seemed normal, just like the hundreds of other times she had flown out of this same terminal. Thomas pulled up to the entrance and quickly came around to open her door. "Have a safe flight, Miss Mitchell," he said, helping her with her suitcase. Sarah tipped him generously, as she always did, and watched as he drove away. The terminal's glass doors gleamed in the morning sunlight, and she could see a few staff members moving around inside. Sarah checked her watch. She was right on schedule as usual. Her heels clicked confidently on the pavement as she walked toward the entrance. She had her documentation ready in her hand, her ID, the flight details Emma had prepared, and all the necessary paperwork. After 15 years in the music industry and countless private flights, this was all routine to her. She noticed a security guard standing near the door, which was normal. What wasn't normal was the way he seemed to stiffen as she approached. Sarah didn't think much of it at first. She was used to people recognizing her, and sometimes they acted a bit differently when they did. She had her professional smile ready, the one she had perfected over years of public appearances and business meetings. The morning was still beautiful, the sky was a perfect California blue, and everything seemed fine. Sarah had no idea that in just a few moments, this routine Tuesday morning would turn into something completely unexpected. She had no way of knowing that what was about to happen would not only change her day, but would end up making headlines and bringing about important changes in the private aviation industry. As she reached for the door handle, pulling her suitcase behind her, Sarah was still thinking about her upcoming meeting in New York. She was excited about the new artists she would be presenting to the label executives. She had no idea that she was about to face a situation that would test her patience, dignity, and resolve in ways she never expected. Just as Sarah's hand touched the door handle, the security guard quickly stepped in front of her. He was tall, probably in his 50s, with gray hair showing under his uniform cap. His name tag read Officer Wilson, and his face wore a stern expression that seemed out of place at this usually welcoming terminal. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his voice carrying a tone that made Sarah pause. "I need to see your documentation." His hand was already out, demanding rather than requesting. Sarah noticed how different this felt from her usual experiences at the terminal, where security was always professional but polite. Sarah calmly reached into her designer bag and pulled out the folder Emma had prepared. "Of course," she said professionally, maintaining her composure. "I have everything right here." She handed him her ID and flight documentation, the same papers she'd shown hundreds of times before at this very terminal. Officer Wilson looked at her papers with exaggerated scrutiny, holding them up to the light and flipping them back and forth multiple times. While he was doing this, Sarah noticed a white businessman walk right past them, giving just a quick nod to the guard. Officer Wilson barely glanced at him before letting him enter. "There seems to be a problem here," Officer Wilson said, his eyes narrowing. "Are you sure you're at the right terminal? This is for private aviation only." His emphasis on the word private made his meaning clear, and Sarah felt her heart rate increase slightly, though her face remained calm. "Yes, I'm quite sure," Sarah replied, her voice steady. "As you can see from my documentation, I'm booked on the 10:30 a.m. flight to New York. My assistant confirmed everything yesterday." She pointed to the flight details on the paper he was holding. The guard shook his head. "These could be incorrect. I'm going to need to see additional identification and proof that you're authorized to be here." Meanwhile, another passenger, also white, walked past them with just a quick flash of ID. Officer Wilson didn't even fully turn to look. Sarah took a deep breath, maintaining her professional demeanor despite the growing tension. "Officer Wilson," she said clearly, "I've been flying from this terminal for over a decade. I'm a regular passenger here. Perhaps you could check with your supervisor if you have concerns." "Ma'am, I don't need to check with anyone," he replied, his voice getting louder. "I'm telling you this is a private terminal, and I'm not convinced you belong here." He moved to block her path more firmly, his body language becoming more aggressive. Sarah noticed other passengers and staff beginning to stare. Some looked uncomfortable, others curious, and a few seemed to be recording with their phones. She could feel her pulse quickening, but years of handling difficult situations in the music industry had taught her to stay composed. Just then, a young woman in a terminal staff uniform walked by and did a double-take. Sarah saw the moment of recognition flash across her face, the widening eyes, the slight gasp. The young woman, whose name tag read Jessica, quickly pulled out her phone and showed something to her colleague. "Oh my God," Jessica whispered to her coworker, loud enough for others to hear. "That's Sarah Mitchell. She just won Producer of the Year at the Grammys. I watched her acceptance speech last month." The atmosphere in the terminal shifted instantly. Other staff members started looking more closely, and whispers spread quickly. Some passengers had their phones out now, clearly recording the incident. Officer Wilson's face showed a flicker of uncertainty for the first time. Sarah remained standing straight, her expression dignified. She wasn't going to let this incident ruffle her, but she also wasn't going to back down. She had worked too hard and come too far to let someone's prejudices stop her from doing her job. "Officer Wilson," she said calmly but firmly, "I understand you're doing your job, but I need to make my flight. Would you like to speak with the terminal supervisor? Or shall we call the airline directly?" Her voice was steady, professional, and carried the quiet authority of someone used to being in charge. The terminal supervisor, Mr. Johnson, came rushing out of his office. He was a middle-aged man in a well-pressed suit, and his face showed clear concern as he approached the scene. Behind him, Jessica, the young staff member who had recognized Sarah, followed closely. "Ms. Mitchell," Mr. Johnson said, slightly out of breath, "I sincerely apologize for any inconvenience. We are honored to have you flying with us today." He turned to Officer Wilson, whose face had now lost its previous confidence. "Officer Wilson, this is Sarah Mitchell, one of our most valued regular passengers." Officer Wilson's face turned red, but he didn't move from his position immediately. "I was just following security protocols," he mumbled, but his voice had lost its earlier authority. The small crowd that had gathered was now watching intently, phone still recording. Sarah looked around at the faces watching them. She saw mixed expressions: embarrassment, anger, sympathy, and shock. This moment, she realized, was bigger than just her trying to catch a flight. It was an opportunity to address something that happened to too many people who didn't have her fame to protect them. "Mr. Johnson," Sarah said, her voice clear and measured, making sure everyone could hear her, "I appreciate your intervention, but I'd like to discuss something important. While I'm glad you recognize me, my right to be treated with respect shouldn't depend on my Grammy Awards or my public profile." The terminal fell silent. Even the usual background noise of computers and conversations seemed to fade away. Sarah continued, her words careful and deliberate. "Every day, people face this kind of treatment simply because of how they look. Most of them don't have the protection of celebrity to shield them. Mr. Johnson nodded seriously, beads of sweat visible on his forehead. You're absolutely right, Ms. Mitchell. This is unacceptable, and we need to address it immediately. Would you be willing to meet with our management team? We want to ensure this never happens again. Officer Wilson shifted uncomfortably, finally stepping aside from the doorway. His earlier bravado had completely disappeared, replaced by evident discomfort as more people gathered to watch the situation unfold. I would be happy to meet with management, Sarah replied, checking her watch. However, I have an important meeting in New York this afternoon. Could we schedule this discussion for when I return tomorrow? This will give everyone time to think about the changes needed. A woman in the crowd suddenly spoke up. Ms. Mitchell, I recorded everything. Would you like a copy of the video? She was holding her phone up, and Sarah could see several others doing the same. Sarah thought carefully before responding. She didn't want to shame anyone publicly, but she knew documentation could be important for creating real change. Thank you, she said. Please send the videos to the terminal management. They might be useful for training purposes. Mr. Johnson quickly arranged for Sarah to be escorted to her flight, assigning Jessica to help with her bags. As they walked through the terminal, several passengers and staff members approached to express their support. Ms. Mitchell, Jessica said quietly as they walked, I've worked here for 2 years, and I've seen this happen before, but nobody ever had the power to speak up like you did. Thank you for saying something. Sarah reached her plane with just enough time for her flight. As she settled into her seat, she pulled out her phone and called Emma, her assistant. Emma, we need to clear my schedule for tomorrow afternoon, she said. Something happened at the terminal, and we have an opportunity to make some real changes. Looking out the plane window, Sarah could see the terminal building getting smaller as they prepared for takeoff. What had started as a routine morning had turned into something much more significant. She knew that tomorrow's meeting wouldn't just be about one incident with one security guard. It would be about creating systemic change in an industry that desperately needed it. Sarah's meeting in New York went perfectly. The record label executives loved her new artists, and she signed all the contracts she had hoped to secure. But throughout the day, her mind kept returning to what had happened at the terminal. Her phone was filled with messages and notifications. The videos from that morning had started spreading on social media. By the time Sarah boarded her return flight to Los Angeles that evening, the incident had gone viral. Emma had been managing the flood of interview requests from news channels and magazines. But Sarah wasn't interested in becoming a headline. She wanted to create real change. The next afternoon, Sarah walked back into the private terminal. This time, everything was different. Mr. Johnson was waiting for her personally at the entrance, along with the terminal's owner, Mrs. Patricia Reynolds, a tall woman in her 60s with silver hair and a determined expression. Ms. Mitchell, Mrs. Reynolds said, extending her hand. Thank you for coming back to speak with us. We prepared a conference room for our discussion. Her voice was sincere, and her eyes showed genuine concern about the situation. The conference room was large, with windows overlooking the runway. Around the table sat 12 people, terminal managers, security supervisors, and 2 diversity consultants who had been called in urgently. Officer Wilson was there too, sitting quietly at one end of the table, looking uncomfortable but present. Before we begin, Sarah said, taking her seat, I want to make something clear. I'm not here for apologies or punishment. I'm here to help create changes that will protect everyone who uses this terminal, regardless of their fame or status. She opened her laptop and showed them something on the screen. Since yesterday, my team has received over 50 messages from people sharing similar experiences at private aviation terminals across the country. This isn't just about one incident or one security guard. It's about a system that needs to change. Mrs. Reynolds nodded seriously. We agree completely, Ms. Mitchell. That's why we've asked you to help us create new training programs and security protocols. We want to become a model for other terminals to follow. For the next 3 hours, they worked together. Sarah shared the stories people had sent her, careful to keep names private. The diversity consultants presented their recommendations. Security supervisors discussed how to maintain safety while ensuring respect for all passengers. Officer Wilson finally spoke up, his voice quiet but clear. I want to apologize, not just to Ms. Mitchell, but to anyone I may have treated unfairly. I never thought of myself as prejudiced, but yesterday showed me I have biases I need to work on." Sarah appreciated his honesty. "Recognition is the first step," she said. "Now we need to turn that recognition into action." They developed a comprehensive plan. All staff would undergo new training programs. Security protocols would be standardized and applied equally to all passengers. A passenger feedback system would be implemented, and monthly reviews would track progress. Jessica, the young staff member who had recognized Sarah the day before, was appointed to lead a new passenger relations team. Her role would include monitoring the implementation of the new policies and being a point of contact for any concerns. As the meeting concluded, Mrs. Reynolds made an announcement. "We're not going to keep this to ourselves," she said. "We're going to share our new protocols with every private aviation terminal in our network. Ms. Mitchell, would you consider being part of our training videos?" Sarah thought about all the messages she had received, all the people who had faced similar discrimination without having the power to fight back. "Yes," she said, "I'll help in any way I can." Walking out of the terminal that evening, Sarah felt hopeful. The incident that could have been just another sad story of discrimination was turning into a catalyst for real change. Her phone buzzed. Emma had set up meetings with other terminal owners who wanted to implement similar changes. Sometimes, Sarah thought, the worst moments could lead to the best opportunities for progress. As she got into her car, she saw Officer Wilson leaving his shift. He nodded at her respectfully, and she nodded back. Change was happening, one small step at a time. 1 month after the incident, Sarah sat in her home studio, reviewing the final cut of the training video she had helped create. The video wasn't just about what had happened to her. It included stories from other travelers, staff members, and security personnel. Each story added another piece to the bigger picture of how bias affected people every day. Emma walked in with Sarah's morning coffee and a stack of reports. "The new training program has already been implemented at 23 private terminals across the country," she said, handing Sarah the documents. "And look at these feedback numbers." Sarah smiled as she looked through the statistics. Passenger complaints about discriminatory treatment had dropped significantly at terminals using the new protocols. More importantly, passengers from all backgrounds reported feeling more welcome and respected. Her phone rang. It was Jessica from the terminal. "Ms. Mitchell, you won't believe what just happened," Jessica said excitedly. "Remember that passenger feedback system you helped us set up? We just got our first perfect score week. Every single passenger rated their experience as positive. But the best news came from an unexpected source. Officer Wilson, who had become an advocate for change himself, was now leading security training sessions. He shared his own story openly, helping other security personnel recognize and address their unconscious biases. Yesterday, Jessica continued, Officer Wilson stopped a senior staff member who was rushing through security without proper checks. He told them, "Our protocols apply to everyone equally now." You should have seen it, Ms. Mitchell. It was like watching your legacy in action. Sarah had been receiving messages from people all over the country. Some shared their own stories of discrimination, while others talked about positive changes they were seeing at their local terminals. One message particularly touched her. "Dear Ms. Mitchell, I'm a young black pilot who often faced suspicion when walking through private terminals. Since your incident and the changes that followed, I've noticed a huge difference. Last week, a security guard who used to always stop me actually welcomed me by name. Thank you for speaking up. Captain Marcus Johnson." The incident had sparked conversations beyond the aviation industry. Other exclusive spaces, high-end hotels, private clubs, and luxury retailers were reaching out to learn about the training program. Sarah's phone buzzed with another message, this time from Mrs. Reynolds. "The International Aviation Authority wants to make our training program the standard for all private terminals worldwide," the message read. "Would you be willing to speak at their annual conference next month?" Sarah looked at the growing pile of success stories on her desk. What had started as a horrible morning had turned into a movement for change. She thought about all the people who would never have to experience what she did, all because she chose to stand up and speak out. Emma came back in with more updates. "The morning news shows want to interview you about the program's success," she said. "And 3 more terminal networks want to implement the training." But Sarah was most proud of the small changes, like how Jessica had been promoted to head of customer relations at the terminal, or how Officer Wilson now mentored new security staff, teaching them that true security meant making everyone feel safe and respected. "Should I schedule those interviews?" Emma asked, tablet in hand. Sarah nodded. "Yes, but let's focus on the changes being made, not just my story, and see if Officer Wilson and Jessica would be willing to speak too. People need to hear all sides of this story." Looking out her studio window at the California sunset, Sarah thought about how one moment of discrimination had led to waves of positive change. Her Grammy Awards sat on a shelf nearby, but somehow, this felt like her most important achievement. She picked up her phone to reply to Mrs. Reynolds. "I'd be honored to speak at the conference, but I'd like to bring some other voices with me. Change happens best when we all share our stories together." The International Aviation Conference Center was packed with over 1,000 people. Sarah sat backstage, reviewing her notes one last time. Next to her, Officer Wilson adjusted his tie nervously, while Jessica checked her presentation slides on her tablet. "Are you ready?" Emma asked, handing Sarah a bottle of water. The audience's chatter could be heard through the curtains. Representatives from private aviation companies worldwide had come to hear about the changes that started with one incident at a Los Angeles terminal. Sarah looked at her unlikely team. 6 months ago, they had been strangers in a tense confrontation. Now, they were about to present together on an international stage. The chairwoman of the conference stepped up to the microphone to introduce them. "Ladies and gentlemen," the chairwoman began, "today we have a remarkable story of how one incident led to positive change across the aviation industry. Please welcome Grammy-winning producer Sarah Mitchell, along with Security Officer James Wilson and Customer Relations Director Jessica Thompson." The spotlight followed them as they walked onto the stage. Sarah reached the podium first, looking out at the sea of faces. She saw terminal owners, security chiefs, and aviation executives from around the world. All were here to learn how to make their spaces more inclusive. 6 months ago, Sarah began, her voice clear and strong. "I was stopped from boarding my private flight because of how I looked. Today, I'm not here to talk about that moment of discrimination. I'm here to talk about what happened next and how it changed not just one terminal, but an entire industry." She stepped aside, letting Officer Wilson take the podium. His hands shook slightly as he adjusted the microphone. "I was the security guard who stopped Ms. Mitchell that day," he said, his voice steady despite his nervousness. "I didn't think I was prejudiced, but that incident made me look hard at my own biases. Now, I help other security personnel recognize and overcome theirs." The audience listened intently as Jessica presented the data from their new training program. Passenger satisfaction was up 47%. Complaints about discriminatory treatment had dropped by 89%. Staff morale had improved by 62%. The numbers told a story of real, measurable change. But the most important changes can't be measured in numbers, Jessica explained, showing pictures of happy passengers and staff. "It's in the smiles we see every day, the thank you notes we receive, and the sense of welcome that every passenger feels when they enter our terminal." Sarah returned to the podium to share some of the messages they had received. She read Captain Marcus Johnson's letter, and others like it. Each story showed how their changes had touched real lives. Suddenly, a hand rose from the middle of the audience. "Miss Mitchell," a woman called out, "I own 3 private terminals in Europe. Last month, we had an incident similar to yours. What's the first step we should take to implement these changes?" More hands went up. Terminal owners from Asia, Africa, and South America all wanted to know how they could bring these changes to their facilities. Sarah looked at Officer Wilson and Jessica, who nodded encouragingly. "The first step," Sarah answered, "is to acknowledge that bias exists everywhere. The second step is to be willing to learn and change. And the third step is to work together, because real change happens when we all commit to it." For the next hour, they answered questions from the audience. Terminal owners shared their own stories and challenges. Security chiefs asked about specific training techniques. By the end of the session, 37 terminal networks had signed up to implement their program. Backstage after the presentation, Sarah hugged Jessica and shook Officer Wilson's hand. Emma was already scheduling follow-up meetings with interested terminals. "I never thought that morning would lead to this," Officer Wilson said, looking at the crowd still discussing their presentation in the hall. Sometimes the worst moments in our lives can lead to the best changes. Sarah smiled, remembering that tense morning 6 months ago. It's not about what happens to us, she said. It's about what we choose to do about it. 1 year had passed since the incident at the Los Angeles terminal. Sarah sat in her favorite coffee shop, reading the latest industry report on her iPad. The numbers made her smile. Over 500 private aviation terminals worldwide had now adopted their training program. Her phone buzzed with a text from Jessica. "Turn on CNN now." Sarah asked the coffee shop owner to switch the TV channel, and her eyes widened at what she saw. A major airline was announcing that they would implement a modified version of their training program across all their public airports. "This is a historic moment in aviation," the airline CEO was saying on TV. "After seeing the success of the private aviation program started by Sarah Mitchell, we knew we had to bring these changes to commercial aviation too." Sarah's coffee grew cold as she watched the announcement. Emma called immediately. "Have you seen the news? Your inbox is exploding. The other major airlines want to talk to us too. Even train stations and bus terminals are calling." Just then, Officer Wilson walked into the coffee shop. This wasn't a coincidence. They met here every month to discuss the program's progress. He had changed a lot in the past year. The stern, biased security guard was gone, replaced by a confident trainer who traveled around the country teaching other security personnel. "Did you see?" he asked, sitting down with his own coffee. "We're going mainstream, Sarah. Commercial airlines. Can you believe it?" His eyes were bright with excitement. He had found his true calling in teaching others about bias and respect. Sarah's phone kept buzzing. Messages were pouring in from around the world. A flight attendant from Singapore sharing how the program had changed her airport's culture. A security guard in London thanking them for the training videos. A passenger from Dubai celebrating how different his travel experience had become. Jessica arrived next, carrying a thick folder. As the program's national director now, she oversaw its implementation at new locations. "Wait till you see these latest success stories," she said, spreading photos across the table. The pictures showed happy faces from airports and terminals worldwide. Staff and passengers taking selfies together, security teams celebrating diversity training graduation, thank you cards from travelers who felt respected and welcomed. A group of teenage girls at the next table recognized Sarah. Instead of asking about her music career or Grammy Awards, one of them said, "My mom's a flight attendant. She says you changed the whole aviation industry. Can we take a picture with you?" Sarah smiled and posed with them. As they took selfies, the girls shared their own stories. One wanted to become a pilot but had been worried about facing discrimination. Another's father was a security guard who had gone through the new training program. "My dad says it opened his eyes," the teenager said proudly. "He treats everyone with respect now, not just at work but everywhere." "You didn't just change airports, you changed people." Emma arrived with more news. The United Nations was interested in adapting their program for international border control points. The Olympics Committee wanted to use it for event security. Universities were asking to include it in their curriculum. "Remember when we thought this would just be about one terminal in Los Angeles?" Jessica asked, looking at the growing pile of success stories on their table. "Now it's becoming a global movement for respect and dignity." Officer Wilson nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes the smallest moments create the biggest changes," he said. "One incident, one decision to speak up, one choice to listen and learn, and look where it led." Sarah looked around the coffee shop. On the TV, they were still discussing the airline's announcement. At nearby tables, people were sharing the news on their phones. The teenage girls were posting their selfies with inspiring messages about change and respect. "We're not done yet," Sarah said, picking up one of the success story photos. "This is just the beginning. Every person who goes through this training, every traveler who feels respected, every staff member who changes their perspective, they all become part of the change." 5 years had passed since that life-changing morning at the Los Angeles private terminal. Sarah sat in her new office at the Mitchell Foundation for Aviation Equality, looking at the wall of achievements before her. The small incident that had started everything had grown into something far bigger than she had ever imagined. Her phone rang. It was Officer Wilson calling from New York. "Sarah, you won't believe who I just met," he said excitedly. "Remember that young girl Amara, who wanted to be a pilot? She just finished her first year of flight school. She's going to be one of our student speakers at next month's conference. Sarah smiled, remembering the little girl from 3 years ago. Now, Amara was 19 and well on her way to achieving her dream. The aviation industry had changed so much that young people like her didn't have to fear discrimination holding them back. Emma rushed into the office with breaking news. The United Nations just voted. She announced breathlessly. Our training program is now part of the international aviation standards. Every airport and terminal in member countries will have to implement it. Sarah stood up and walked to her window, looking out at the busy streets of Los Angeles. The Mitchell Foundation now occupied an entire floor of a downtown office building. From here, they ran training programs, developed new policies, and worked with aviation companies worldwide. Jessica, now the Foundation's executive director, came in with more updates. The latest numbers are amazing, she said, spreading papers across Sarah's desk. Over 5,000 facilities in 120 countries using our program. More than 500,000 staff trained. And discrimination complaints are nearly zero at participating locations. But here's the best part, Jessica continued, pulling out a special report. Other industries are copying our model. Hotels, restaurants, retail stores, they're all adapting our training program. We're changing how people think about respect and dignity everywhere. Sarah picked up a framed photo from her desk. It showed her standing with Officer Wilson and Jessica in front of that terminal 5 years ago, the day everything changed. Next to it was a recent picture of Officer Wilson training new security staff, his face proud and confident. Sometimes I think about that morning, Sarah said softly. How different things might have been if I had just let it go, if I hadn't spoken up. She looked at another photo, this one showing Amara in her flight school uniform, standing proudly next to her training plane. Just then, her computer beeped with a video call. It was Mrs. Reynolds, the former terminal owner who had first supported their changes. Though retired now, she still served on the Foundation's board. Sarah, dear, Mrs. Reynolds said warmly. I just watched the news about the UN vote. Do you remember what you told me 5 years ago? You said you wanted to create change that would last. Well, my dear, you've done it. Emma brought in the day's mail, letters from people whose lives had been touched by their program. A black business executive thanking them for making travel respectful. A Muslim family celebrating their first stress-free airport experience. A young Asian pilot writing about how different the industry felt now. Sarah read each letter carefully, just as she had done with the first ones they received 5 years ago. Each story reminded her why their work mattered. Each thank you note showed how far they had come. The Foundation's walls were covered with news articles, awards, and photos showing their journey. But Sarah's favorite was a simple frame holding her old terminal access card from that day. Under it was a small plaque with words she had spoken at their first training session. Change begins with one person standing up, but it succeeds when everyone stands together. As the afternoon sun filled her office, Sarah looked at her calendar for the next day. She had a meeting with space tourism companies about implementing their program for future civilian space travel. Their work wasn't just changing the present, it was shaping the future.